Chapter 43 of The Pioneers by Katharine Susanna Prichard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. The big kitchen was very quiet. The log that had been smouldering on the open hearth all day broke. Deirdre swept back the scattered embers and thrust the broken ends of wood together. Flames leapt over them, lighting the room. They penetrated the shadows that bulked, huge and shapeless, at the end of it, revealing a hoard of store casks and boxes piled almost to the roof and half cloaked with hessian bags sewed together. The barrel of a rifle slung on the walls glimmered for a moment. The firelight showed stirrup irons and miscellaneous harnessing gear. Halters and bridles hung over a peg near the door, a couple of horseshoes nailed to it, and 2 or 3 hams in smoke-blackened bags with bunches of herbs beside them strung up to the rafters. A tallow dip cast a halo of garish light about Deirdre where she sat sewing. A broad gleam touched the crockery on the shelves behind her. The high-backed armchair in which Steve lay, slack and nodding drowsily, was drawn up before the fire. The door to the bar, reached by a step from the kitchen, was open. A dip burned on the bench there too, giving the dingy windows of the shanty a gleam for wayfarers. It was a wild night. The wind blowing from the south-west beat against the doors and rattled the windows of the frail building. The doors were all shut, though it was still early. Steve at last fell asleep in his chair. His heavy laboured breathing had the sound of a child sobbing. Deirdre looked up from her work again and again, troubled by it. It increased her sense of desperation to hear him. The sound became unendurable. She got up at last and wakened him. "Hadn't you better go to bed, Uncle Steve?" she said impatiently. "You'll catch your death of cold like this. It's too late for anybody to be coming our way now, and a bad night. I'll lock up." "Yes, Deirdre," he murmured sleepily. "It's a bad night, and too late for anybody to be coming our way." She pulled the bolts across the doors at the front of the shanty and locked and bolted the door from the bar into the kitchen. Then she took his arm and helped him out of his chair. He had fallen back into it, nodding drowsily again. She led him over to his room, which opened off the kitchen. "I'll see the lights and the fires are out," she said, "but I want to finish a bit of mending before I go to bed." "Right," he murmured. "Right, Deirdre." The noise of the wind carried off the droning tones of his voice, but it was only a few moments before she heard his heavy breathing again. The Schoolmaster's sock which she was darning dropped from her hand. She stared into the darkness beyond the dip light. She did not want to go to bed, to be alone in the darkness with her thoughts. In the kitchen she heard the creaking gossip of the fire and the whisper of falling embers. Besides, she wanted to keep her hands and brain busy. In the darkness there would be only the voice of the wind in her ears, and that was like the crying of her heart. She listened to the wind now. A mournful, passionate thing, it murmured about the house, rising, wildly, desperately, in blasts of sudden rage, and fell back into a thin, pitiful wailing of helplessness and despair. She was afraid to listen long, afraid of what this communicating, interpreting murmur might do with her reason. Yet the wind was with her, she thought. The wind knew her heart. The wind was the voice of her heart crying out there in the darkness. She shivered, trying to banish the strange, fantastical ideas that swarmed upon her. How to pass the night, this long night in which she must not think or feel. Tomorrow McNab would be coming. "You pays your money and you takes your choice, Deirdre," he had said. She saw his face as he had spoken, his twisted, sallow face, the glimmering of his malicious eyes, with the smile that spilled over from them. She had made her choice. She had set her mind to it. There must be no wavering. If the Schoolmaster got off, she must marry McNab. If he was sentenced to 3 years' imprisonment, there would perhaps be time to scheme and outmanoeuvre him. She would set her wits to that, but she could not think of the next day. She must think of Davey or Dan or Steve, any of them. There must be no shrinking, shrieking or failing. What had to be done, and the first thing that had to be done was to give McNab her word. She picked up the sock she had been mending again. The needle slipped backwards and forwards, across, under and over the dark threads. She worked steadily. The voice of the wind drew her mind again. It tugged gently and then carried her away on its plaintive wailing. Her hands fell in her lap as she listened. Her heart swayed. It went out to the wind again. There was a clatter of horses' hoofs on the road. The sound startled her, but it was not until she heard the dogs barking in the yard that she realised some late rider had come to Steve's, that there would be food and drink, and probably a shakedown to get ready. She waited for the sound of footsteps on the veranda, and a rap on the door of the bar. The back door flung open, and on a gust of wind and rain a tall gaunt figure swung into the kitchen. "Conal!" Deirdre cried, and flew to him. In her gladness at seeing him, the past was a blurred page. She forgot it when she saw him in the doorway, his weather-beaten face turned to her. Her confidence in him, all the old joyous affection rushed over her. His face was shining with rain, his hair and beard wet. From the way his breath came and went, and the muscles were whipped out from his neck, she knew that he had been riding hard. "They tell me Davey and Dan are on trial in Melbourne," he said. "Yes." "What happened? What's been doing, Deirdre?" he gasped. "I've only just heard of it. It's taken me a couple of days to get here. I don't know anything but what I've told you. Thought p'raps you could tell me something before I go up to them. And give me something to eat and drink. I haven't had anything since yesterday morning." He wrenched off his wet coat and dropped into Steve's chair. He had a gauntness that Conal used not to have, but his eyes, those eyes of fierce tenderness, were the eyes of the big brotherly man who had been the companion of so many of her and the Schoolmaster's wanderings. She quickly put some food on the table for him, set the kettle on the bar over the fire, and while he was eating told him what she knew of Davey's arrest and Dan's going to swear Davey's innocence of the charge brought against him. "Why did he do that? Davey was more in it than he was," Conal asked savagely. "I don't know." Deirdre hesitated. "Yes, I do, Conal. It was because Mrs. Cameron..." "Oh, that was it, was it?" Conal went on eating hungrily. "What do they say about here? Do they think Davey'll get off and Dan'll have to pay?" "You've heard of Mr. Cameron's death, Conal?" Deirdre asked. "They say that'll make all the difference. Davey can't very well be accused of stealing his own cattle, and McNab..." "What has he got to say about it? Of course, it's his hand in it all." "He says I'm the cause." Her voice faltered. "What's that?" Conal's knife and fork clattered to the table. "Did you know?" she asked. "Did you know, Conal, Steve and father came from the island over there?" He moved uneasily. "No," he said, but uncertainly. "Who says so?" "McNab. He did the chain trick here on Steve. Scared him to death when he was by himself one afternoon. Seems he wasn't quite sure before, but Steve in his fright gave him all the proofs he wanted. And McNab's promised to use all he knows against father and Steve unless... Says he only put the troopers on to this cattle business to get you and Davey out of the way, though he had another score to work off against Mr. Cameron too. But he says he always suspected about Steve and father, and was only waiting for a chance to be sure of it, to make me marry him." "By God!" Conal spun from his chair. His oaths startled the birds from their night perches under the roof. "He'll not do that, Deirdre," he cried. "Not while there's life in me. Rot him, the crawler. To come here scaring the wits out of you. I'll screw the last breath out of him before..." He made for the door. Deirdre went after him. She put her hand on his arm. "You'll do no good now, Conal," she said. "You're done yourself. Rest till morning. Then you can go to McNab. If he knows there's a man about to stand by me, p'raps he won't dare do what he said." Conal jerked himself away from her. "No, I'll swear he won't." "But you'll do nothing at all if you go now," she urged. "And I'll have nobody without you. If you'll only rest and sleep now and go in the morning, it'll be better. You'll be able to put the fear of God into McNab perhaps, if he sees you strong and ready to make him do what you want." "Sleep?" He cursed under his breath. "Do you think there's any sleep will come to me when I think that McNab a filthy, damned swine like McNab could come near you? I'd kill him if he touched a hair of your head." Her hands fell from him. Conal's face was distorted with rage. His words brought back memory of the shot that had almost killed Davey. Conal guessed what her movement meant. "Do you still believe?" He lifted her chin and looked into her eyes. "Do you still believe I fired that shot in the dark, Deirdre?" "Did you, Conal?" she asked simply. He turned from her with a gesture of disappointment. "Oh, it was in anger, and when you weren't sure of what you were doing. I know," she cried. He opened the door. "You're not going to-night?" she asked. "No, you're right. It'll be better to wait till the morning," he said, with, for Conal, a strange quietude. "I want to give the mare a rub down and a feed. Are there any bones for Sally? Throw a shake down by the fire for me. I'll be in directly." Chapter 44 of The Pioneers, by Katharine Susannah Pritchard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. Conal was early astir. Deirdre heard him moving in the kitchen and then out of doors. When he came in again, she had spread a cloth on the end of the table, bacon and eggs were spluttering in a shallow pan on the hearth, a pot of porridge was ready for him, the kettle steaming. Conal's face was sombre. It was easy to see that he had not slept and that his mind was set to a plan of action. He ate without speaking and got up to go. Ginger was standing saddled by the door, her reins trailing beside her. She cropped the young grass that showed vivid green blades about the water barrel, and was nourished by the drips from the roof spouts and leakages from the barrel itself. Deirdre heard the click-click of Ginger's snaffle, the chirping of young birds under the roof, while Conal was eating. There was a solemnity, a wrapped-up purposefulness about him this morning. She dared not ask him what he was going to do. It was a fresh morning with frost in the air. A sparkling rime lay out on the grass in the paddocks and spread under the straggling shades of the sheds and the stables in crisp white patches. The sunshine splashed golden over the hills. It lay in long shafts of purest brilliance on the paddocks and across the stable yard. Conal went out of doors. Deirdre followed him. "Conal!" she cried. There was appeal in her voice. He had gathered Ginger's reins in his hand. The mare turned her head, her great beautiful eyes on Deirdre. "It's no good your saying anything, Deirdre, telling me what to do and what not to do," Conal said roughly. "I've thought it all out. I know what's got to be done. I'll do it the best way I can." He understood the prayer of her eyes. "Do you think I want his blood on my hands?" he asked irritably. "But he's got to let you go, Deirdre. He's got to. There's no two ways about it, and if he says a word about the Schoolmaster or Steve, he'll have to reckon with me then. And the reckoning'll be a short one. That's the bargain I'm going to make with him. And I'll hold him responsible, if ever the story gets out. He'll pay all the same, and I'll swear that, on the soul of my mother. Do you think my life's worth a straw to me? Do you think, if it is a question of yours and Dan's life against McNab's, I can hesitate?" He threw back his head with the old reckless movement. "Not much! Lord, I'd take what was coming to me cheerin' if I thought I'd put things right for the Schoolmaster and you. But if a knockin' about'll do Thad any good instead, he's welcome to it. If I can get what I want out of him with a scarin', there'll be no need to go further. If I promise him on the reddest oath under the sun, and he's pretty sure I mean it, it'll do instead, perhaps. But I'm not taking any chances of his tricking me. I can't afford to take chances, Deirdre. If I don't feel I've got him that way." She knew what he meant. "It'll be a long day till you're back, Conal," she said. He swung into his saddle and went out to the road. She watched the bay with her long easy stride, and Conal swinging above her till the trees hid them. There was no doubt in her mind that when Conal let his tongue loose, unleashed the rage in him, McNab would do what he wanted. Conal was not known as Fighting Conal for nothing, and he was credited with being a man of his word. Reckless and daredevil as he was, none knew better than McNab that he cared neither for God nor man when his blood was up, and that he would assuredly do as he said though the heavens fell. Everybody knew the cringing coward McNab was. More than one of the men he had sold had threatened to wipe off old scores without leave or licence. A threat more or less might not have mattered, but each one intensified McNab's terror of the clutch of iron finger in the night, the swift blade of a knife, the short bark of a pistol. It was easy to scare Steve with the clank of a chain, but the click of a pistol behind McNab turned him livid, a greenish hue spread on his face. Deirdre knew the frenzy of McNab's fear, but she knew too his shrewd brain. While Conal was there he would dominate, convert him into the shaking, shrieking thing McNab became when the fear of violence or a violent death took possession of him. But afterwards, when Conal was gone, his brain would get to work, that cunning brain of his, quickened by a sense of his injuries and his spluttering, passionate fear and hate of the man who had humiliated and thwarted him. Deirdre wondered how it would fare with Conal then, whether McNab would outwit him. He would try. He was made that way, McNab, to scheme out of holes and corners. If Conal would have to reckon with him in the end, she realised that it would have been better to let the reckoning be now, before any further mischief was done. Yet her mind shuddered at the thought. She knew that she had meant to delay it. When Steve came shambling into the yard, blinking at the sunlight, she told him that Conal had returned and that he had gone down to the Black Bull, but would be back by the evening. He exclaimed all the morning about Conal's coming, and had 1,000 questions to ask. Where had Conal been? What had he been doing? Why was it he had gone off the way he did without saying a word to anybody? All of which Deirdre had not thought to ask. But they talked about Conal all the morning. Steve came in from cutting ferns for the cowshed to ask if Conal was going to stay long. What was he going to do? Was he going up to the trial? Had she told him what McNab had said to them? Deirdre wanted to be very busy all day, so that the time would not seem long till Conal returned. Steve with his questions made a little current of joyous excitement. Ordinarily the days were very still and empty. She swept and dusted, cooked their food, washed the dishes and sewed, with latterly only anxious thoughts to occupy her mind. "How is he looking, Conal?" Steve asked, coming to the door when she was beating cream into butter in a Delft bowl. He had come in as the idea for a new question occurred to him. "Oh, well," she said, "but he'd been riding hard and was tired out. I think he's a bit thinner than he used to be, and he was awfully hungry." "You gave him a drop of grog?" he asked anxiously. Deirdre nodded. "He was wet through. I thought he'd have his death of cold to day." "But he was all right this morning?" "Oh, yes." "Where did he come from?" She shook her head. "Hadn't you better finish laying down the ferns?" she said. "He may be back sooner than we think, and then you'll want to talk to him." "Oh, yes." He shuffled out of doors again. A moment later he put his head in the window. His shabby, drooping hat was outlined against the blank of sunshine. His face looked in at her under the shadow of his hat, bright with a question. "What did he go to the Wirree for, Deirdre?" "Oh," she hesitated. "He wanted to see McNab." "Why?" Steve chewed the cud of a wondering thought. "Why did he want to see McNab, Deirdre?" "He'll tell you when he comes," she said. The bare kitchen had the musky, warm smell of newly baked bread, and of curdy, sweet buttermilk by the afternoon. Deirdre had made bread and new butter for Conal. She had prepared a good meal for him when he came home in the evening. After she had scrubbed the wooden table until it was of a weathered whiteness and redded the bricks round the hearth, she looked about for other household tasks to work at so that the day would seem shorter. It was late in the afternoon when she brushed her hair, twisted it up anew, put on a fresh frock and sat down to sew until Conal came. Steve went out to the road every now and then to see if there were any signs of him. Deirdre glanced at the shadows the trees cast. She dared not expect Conal before sunset. Her needle flew in and out of a piece of stiff, unbleached linen Mrs. Cameron had given her some time ago. She thought of her when she was afraid to think of Conal and what was happening in Wirreeford. The sun sank behind the distant line of hills, and the jackasses on the high branches of the trees by the road laughed their good night to the sun. She could not restrain her impatience any longer, and went to the road, her eyes strained to see Conal and his bay horse forging out of the gloom that was beginning to gather among the trees, hanging mysterious, impalpable veils across the ends of the track where the trees met over it, and dwindled into a wavering thread. She lay down by the roadside and pressed her ear to the earth to listen for the sound of hoof beats, but only the forest murmurs came to her, the moan of the wind in the valleys, the leafy murmur of the trees, the creaking of broken and swaying branches, the faint calling of birds, all confused and mingled in a vague wave of sound. The last hoot hoot of the jackasses in the misty depths of the hills drifted across the quiet evening air. The cows had gathered against the paddock fence and were lowing plaintively for the evening milking. Deirdre drove them into the yard and milked. When she had taken the pails indoors, she went again to the road, gazed down into the darkness that had now gathered over the track, and listened for the rapid beat of hoofs on the road. A glimmer of light in the shanty windows told Deirdre that Steve had lighted up. He came to the door. "Conal's late, Deirdre," he called. "Yes," she replied. She stood there quite still, staring down the road. "What do you think can have kept him?" Steve had come out and was standing beside her. Her face was very wan to his old eyes, her dark hair blue in tendrils about it. "I don't know." She saw the anxiety start in his eyes. "Oh, it's all right." She took his arm and they went towards the house again. "He'll be having a game of cards with the boys. It's too soon to expect him, that's all. We'll go in and have supper." She spread the table and put out the hot dinner she had made for Conal. Steve's hunger increased at the savoury smell of it, and because it was later than they usually had their meal, he ate steadily and with ready relish. Deirdre sat down at the table with him. "Aren't you going to have anything?" he asked, when he saw that she was not eating. "I'll wait for Conal," she said. Steve dozed in his chair afterwards. The night that closed in on the forest was of a soft, thick darkness. Deirdre stood in the doorway looking out into it for a while. Not a star hung its silver lamp over the hills. The wind crept with slow, uncertain breaths about the shanty. She shut the door. She carried her work basket with the socks that she had been mending the night before to the table, but she could not work. Her hands would not stir. She sat listening, listening, listening. Steve had taken out his pipe and sucked it, nodding in his chair by the fire. His teeth relaxed their grip as he dozed. The pipe fell on the floor. Deirdre started to her feet as a sound broke the stillness. It wakened him too. He stared stupidly about him with sleep-dazed eyes. "What's that?" he asked. "Has Conal come yet?" "No," she said, picking up the pipe. "Perhaps you'd better not wait up for him." "Yes, yes," he muttered testily. "Of course I'll wait." He sank back into his chair and presently was sleeping again. Deirdre went back to the table and sat there staring before her, listening fixedly. Hour after hour went by. A quick breath crossed her lips. She ran to the door and threw it open. A gust of wind rushed into the room and it brought the sound of a horse on the road. She slammed the door and went back to the hearth, raked the embers and pulled back the log so that it fell with a shower of sparks and the flames leapt up over the new wood. She moved the pots with Conal's dinner in them nearer the fire, and opening the door again, stood by it waiting. Ginger swung round the corner and Conal on her. He was riding low, huddled against her neck. The way he dropped from the saddle drove the breath from Deirdre's body. He threw out his arms and staggered forward. He would have fallen if she had not been there to hold him. She dragged him indoors, leaning against her. "Steve! Steve!" she called. The old man was beside her in an instant. Conal had fallen, his legs crumpling up under him. There was a stain of blood on his clothes. Deirdre tore them from the place where the blood welled. She put the brandy Steve brought to Conal's lips and sent Steve for water and rags, telling him where to find the soft scraps she kept together for burns or cuts. "It's like the wound Davey had," Steve cried when he saw the way the flesh was ploughed up on Conal's breast, "only nearer the heart." Conal moaned as the cold water struck him. A damp sweat lay on his forehead. "It's all up. I'm done for," he muttered. "Give me your hand, Deirdre. Never thought I'd reach you. But I couldn't die there in the dark down by the creek." His voice failed. "Don't try to talk, Conal dear," she begged. "You'll be all right if you keep quiet. Lie still. Davey was." But there was a greyness about Conal's face, a dimness that Davey's had not had. "Davey?" he muttered. "Davey." His eyes opened. They were the wild, bright eyes, reckless and challenging, of Fighting Conal. "You believe I shot Davey?" "No." Deirdre bent over him, her breath coming sobbingly. I don't believe it now, Conal. The same hands that did this to you, did it to Davey too." "A damn whisperin' slug in the dark," he gasped. "It was by the culvert over the creek too from the cover of the trees. And I know whose hand it was. I saw the slinking hound. By God! Why did I let him off? Why did I think I'd got him tight enough?" He sank back against her arm with a spasm of pain. She put the spirit to his lips. "If only I'd choked the life out of him, I could die easy. But the mare bolted. I couldn't get her back to him. The lying cur! The bargain was made. I thought I'd got him, that he'd have made over his last penny to me. Someone kept me talking outside the bull. It was that kid minds his horses, saying that Ginger had gone lame. And the next thing was a shot from the creek and McNab scuttling among the trees. Poor!" He moved impatiently. "Why didn't I do for him while I had the chance?" Superhuman strength animating him for a moment, he struggled up, his swart face stiffening, his eyes flashing. "I can. I'm alive yet. I can, Deirdre." He swayed and she caught him, breaking the shock of his fall backwards. Blood welled from the opened wound. The wet pads had staunched the flow for a moment. Steve brought more water. She dipped fresh linen and rags in it and bound them into place. Conal lay heavy and still. She bent over him, her eyes turned questioningly to Steve. She lifted Conal's head onto her knees. The silence was unbroken. "Conal," she whispered, as though she were calling him. "Conal." "That you, Deirdre?" he asked huskily, but he did not open his eyes. If you could kiss me. It's so hard to go, feeling you near, and that you don't care for me at all. If only I hadn't failed you this time. If only but it was because of you I didn't want to kill him unless it was necessary. It seemed all right the other way. You won't think badly of me, Deirdre?" "No, no, Conal dear, but don't try to talk now. I've been hard on you, Deirdre. But you won't think ill of me. It's the way men are made. And I didn't understand how it was with you and Davey not till that night in the hut. If I hadn't brought trouble between you, you might forgive me." "Conal, Conal," Deirdre sobbed, the tears streaming over her face. "You're dear to me, yourself. Dear in your own way. Haven't you always been? And I haven't been good to you, always. My heart's breaking to hear you talk like this." She bent over and kissed him. Conal opened his eyes. The mellow light of serene happiness had drifted into them. They rested on her face as though they were loath to leave it. His long fingers were knotted about her hands. "I'm happier than I ever was in my life, Deirdre darling," he whispered. She had to stoop over him to catch the words on his lips, so faint and hoarsely uttered they were, as though the thoughts left him without his lips having power to form them. "Never expected to put my head on your knees, hold your hand like this. It would never have happened if I'd lived. So it's good to die. You'll look after Ginger for pluck, dear old devil. Never have got here but for her. And Sally, good old Sally. Not a cattle mung like her, countryside." The ghost of a smile flitted over his lips. "If only..." Recollection of McNab came, banishing the peaceful happiness from his face. His eyes blazed. There was a momentary struggle for breath, and he fell back, fighting for life. Then, on a long sigh, he was still. Deirdre tried the brandy again. She called him. She felt for his heart. His head was very heavy on her knees. She stared down on the finely chiselled features, so still, upraised before her. Her tears rained over them. The quiet was unbroken but for Steve's crying like a child. Then Sally, lying crouched against the door of the hut, lifted her voice in a long, mournful howl that told the shrouded hills and all the creatures of them that the soul of her master, Long Conal, Conal the fighter, had passed on. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45 of The Pioneers by Katharine Susannah Pritchard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. Deirdre knew that McNab would not come near Steve's while the dead body of Conal lay there. In the morning she saddled the chestnut and rode into Wirreeford. "It was you shot Conal, and I'm going to let all the countryside know it," she said, facing McNab in the reeking parlour of the Black Bull. "And who do you think will believe you?" McNab sidled up to her, his eyes kindling. "Everybody who knows you." "And they'll say to you, 'How do you know? What proof have you got, Deirdre?' Nobody'll want to go agen Thad McNab less they're sure. And nobody'll want to be getting up and giving evidence against McNab less they're sure they're coming out on the right side of the business." "Proof? There's proof enough." Deirdre's voice rang clear, though her heart was beginning to quail. She knew what he said was true. She had come with the idea of using Conal's death as a weapon against McNab, but it had suddenly become empty and useless in her hands. "Now look here, my dear, it's no use being nasty," McNab said. "You know and I know there's no man in the Wirree would go against me, less he was pretty sure of getting somebody stronger than himself to back him. Well, is he going to get anybody? That's the question." Deirdre thought of M'Laughlin sodden with drink, and as much McNab's creature as any other man in the Wirree. McNab chuckled, though there was a nervous edge to his voice. "There's Sergeant M'Laughlin, of course. He's police officer for the district. You can tell him your story if you like, but he's a hard-headed man, M'Laughlin. He'll want proofs. And then don't forget I've still the trump card up my sleeve." Her immobility maddened him. "See here, Deirdre," he said, shaking with rage. "I've been patient with you till now, and I'm not a patient man. You may not have liked the ways of my love making, but they're my ways. Either you take my terms or you leave them. And if you send any more jackanapes to me, you'll find them served as was Conal." "Maybe you're waiting and hoping young Davey'll come overland," he rasped on, to help you. Don't let him get in my way again, Deirdre. Don't let him. If he gets in my way, he'll have to get out of it." "Or you will have to get out of his way." Deirdre's eyes flashed into his. She saw the mean, cunning soul in them. She knew that it would be Davey who would get out, that there was no fighting McNab. Davey would die as Conal had died, of a shot in the dark, or a death-dealing stab in the back. McNab realised that she had measured his chances against Davey Cameron, Davey's chances against him in that moment, for all her proud look. "There's a boat just in the port, taking on some cattle. Brought news from Melbourne," he said. "Davey's acquitted. So's the Schoolmaster. Jury didn't find there was evidence enough to convict. They'll be coming along by the Albatross. She's due in a couple of days. Johnson, Cameron's man, brought word. If you don't marry me, if you're not Mrs. McNab before that boat gets in, it can take your father and Steve along with it. It goes right on to Hobart Town after calling here." Deirdre stumbled out of the room. McNab did not follow her. He knew that she would not fight any more. He watched her swing into her saddle and ride out along the flat, dun-coloured road to the hills. Mrs. Mary Ann, driving a string of snow-white geese along the green ledges of the wayside, called to her. But Deirdre fled on, past the cottage that the Schoolmaster and she had lived in, past the outcroppings of gorse beginning to bud goldenly on the edge of the plains. And McNab chuckled softly, rubbing his hands together. End of chapter 45. Chapter 46 of The Pioneers by Katharine Susannah Pritchard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. The Albatross was in. Just before midday, carts and carryalls had clattered along the road to the port. Deirdre, riding down from the hills at dawn, had seen the schooner on the dim shining screen of sea and sky. There was no wind, and like a great white bird she hovered outside the bar, waiting for the wind and tide to carry her into the quiet waters of the inlet. It was not until midday that a breeze sprang up, sending white, curled breakers high over the bar, and the Albatross, on the crest of them, came sailing into the harbour. She rode, furling her sails, to the logwood wharf on its further side. A crowd had gathered to meet her, and it was early afternoon before the vehicles began to rattle back along the road to the hills and Wirreeford. Deirdre stood at the window of McNab's parlour, behind the curtains that had been hung up in her honour, watching them. She saw none of the curious looks and gestures that went her way, the pitiful glances that covered her. For the news of the Port that morning beat any the boat had brought. Those who saw the dim white face of the girl at the window, and her shadowy eyes, knew that she was Thad McNab's wife. They knew that McNab had driven Deirdre Farrell into the Port before any of them were astir, and that a clergyman had married them in the church there. Why did she do it? What could have made her? They asked each other. "It wasn't for love of his beautiful face, be sure," snarled Salt Wilson. "It's hard on the Schoolmaster. He'll not know of it yet," somebody else said. Deirdre neither heard nor saw them. She was watching for Davey and Dan to pass. She had seen Mrs. Ross and Jessie go by to the Port in Cameron's double-seated buggy. She thought they would ride together to the hills in that, Davey and her father. If they knew, they would stop at the Black Bull. If no one had told them, they would go on, she had decided. They would wonder why she was not on the wharf when the boat got in, to meet them. But McNab would not have that. He would not lose sight of her. Besides, she did not want to meet the eyes of the men and women who would be there, and hear what they had to say. She was cut off from the world as she stood at the window of McNab's house. Her mind was too utterly weary to reason further. As she watched and waited, a sense of bleak desolation closed in on her. Her eyes ached for the sight of the Schoolmaster's form against the clear sky, although she knew she would hardly see it above the buggy and among other people. She asked herself what he would do when he found that she was not waiting for him at Steve's, what he would think when he found the letter that was lying for him there. Steve would have to read it for him. It would break his heart, the letter that she had wept and prayed over, but it was better that his heart should break than that he should go to the island again. And Steve, poor old Steve, would die in peace some day, and be put to rest where they had put Conal. A magistrate, assisted in a fashion by M'Laughlin and a jury, had duly investigated and found that his tragic death was an impenetrable mystery. An open verdict, they called the finding. Conal's resting place was on a sunny hillside under a blossoming white gum in which the bees hummed drowsily in the springtime, and through which the green parrots flashed all the year. It was good to think that Steve would draw his last breath in freedom, and then sleep there under the blue sky. But for her, there would be no freedom, no open spaces. Life had become a prison from which there was only one gate, death, and that she would not be able to open because she was a hostage for other lives. Dan and Steve's, perhaps Davey's. Cameron's buggy rounded a turn in the road. Mrs. Ross and Jessie were in it, and there was a man's figure beside theirs. Only one though. The horse, moving at her slow, steady jog trot, drew nearer. Deirdre saw clearly the man who was driving. It was Davey. The Schoolmaster was not with him. A panic seized her. She flew out to the road. The horse stopped automatically. "Where's father?" she cried. Davey stared at her. He scarcely knew her, this wild, white-faced creature with burning eyes and colourless lips. "Hasn't he come?" she asked. "No," he said slowly. He got down from the buggy. His heart ached at the sight of her. He hardly knew how to speak. He moved to take her hands. She shrank from him. "Why didn't he come?" "Because oh, Deirdre, it breaks my heart to tell you," he broke out. "Don't look at me like that. I did all I could, but it was no good. Some cursed brute gave information." "Oh," she whispered, "it was that then." And after a moment, "They took him again for being at large before the expiration of sentence." "Yes." His eyes were all tenderness and pity for her. "When, Davey?" "Just before we were leaving, 4 days ago. Don't look like that, Deirdre. I won't leave a stone unturned to get him back, and I promised him that we..." She laughed, a strange, crackling little laugh. "Deirdre!" He was perplexed and hurt. "Don't come near me." She turned away from him and ran into the house under the swinging sign of the Black Bull with red-rimmed eyes. Davey attempted to follow her. He saw McNab in the doorway. "What the hell's she doing there?" he muttered. Mrs. Ross and Jessie eyed each other anxiously. They did not speak for a minute. Then the elder woman said nervously, uncertainly, Perhaps she came down with Steve to meet the Schoolmaster. But we'd better be going on, Davey. Don't risk any trouble with Thad McNab today. Your mother's waiting eagerly for you. You're her only thought now, all she has got." Davey climbed into the buggy again. His face was sombre. He had not got over the shock of his father's death, and Deirdre's manner wounded and bewildered him. He thought that she was distraught with agony and disappointment on the Schoolmaster's account. He had imagined how tenderly he would tell her what had happened, and comfort her. Now to find her at the Black Bull, not at Steve's where he had thought she would be, and Mrs. Ross and Jessie beside him, when he wanted to fold her into his arms and assure her that he would never rest until Dan was with them again. He swore at every jolt and jar on the road to relieve his impatience. It was Mrs. Ross who said to Mary Cameron, taking her aside when mother and son had met, and Davey was turning Bess into the paddock again. "It's true what we heard about Deirdre Farrel going to marry McNab. She was married to him this morning. You'd better break the news to Davey. He doesn't know yet. I dursn't tell him for fear he'd go to McNab. I wanted to bring him safe to you. Jessie and I'll go home now. No doubt you'd like to have the house to yourself, but if you want anything, or there's anything we can do for you." "We're always glad to do anything for you, Mrs. Cameron dear," Jessie said softly. "It's a queer, heartless girl, Deirdre is, to play fast and loose with the love of a fine fellow like Davey," Mrs. Ross said when Jess was outside setting their bundles and baskets into the cart. "Oh, she wouldn't do that, Deirdre," Mrs. Cameron replied. "It's something dreadful that's driven her to it." "Yes, I suppose it is," Mrs. Ross sighed. "Poor child. Perhaps I'm spiteful about it, Mary, but maybe now that she is out of the way, Davey may think of my Jessie again." Davey's mother smiled sadly. "I'd be sorry for any woman he married but Deirdre, for she has the whole of him, heart and soul," she said. "Oh well, it's a pity." Mrs. Ross kissed her goodbye. "Jess had better make up her mind to have Buddy Morrison then, and that's what I've been telling her this long time. He's a good lad, very fond of her, and been wanting to marry her for the last 5 years." When Jess and her mother had gone, driving off in their high jolting buggy, Davey and Mrs. Cameron went indoors together. He had aged considerably since she last saw him. It was a stern, strange face to her, this her boy's. There was sorrow, self-repression, a bitter realisation of life and what it means in heartache and disappointment in his expression. Something of power and assurance too. She was wondering how she could tell him, covering him with tender, pitiful glances, and praying that he would not leave her, that no hurt might come to him, when he asked suddenly, "Have you seen anything of Deirdre, mother?" He had been moving restlessly about the room, lifting things from their place on the mantelpiece and putting them back again. She called him to her, and putting her hands on his head, told him what Mrs. Ross had said. Davey's face hardened and whitened slowly. He put her hands away from him and wheeled unsteadily from the room. She heard him go across the yard, and saw him stumbling up the narrow track to the trees on the far side of the hill. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of The Pioneers by Katharine Susannah Pritchard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. Mrs. Cameron was feeding her chickens when she thought she heard someone calling. She listened, and decided that it was only a whispering of wind in the trees that had caught her ear. The mild light of the evening lingered about her. Her eyes lay on the hill that rose with a gentle slope beyond the yard, the barns and stable, and a score of low-built brushwood sheds. Mists were beginning to gather among the trees that fringed the top on either side. Davey had gone up among those trees. The sound of her name called faintly again disturbed her. She looked down towards the road that wound uphill out of the forest. It was wraith-like in the twilight, the long white gate that barred it from the paddock about the house growing dim. The gum sapling of 2 or 3 years' growth, with their powdery grey leaves pressing on the far side of the fence behind the barn, shivered as the surface of still water shivers when something stirs beneath it. Her eyes were directed towards the centre of the almost imperceptible movement. Someone called her, faintly, whisperingly. Going towards the fence, she saw a wan face and wide eyes among the leaves. The lines of a long dark dress went off into the shadows among the trees. "Deirdre!" she cried. The girl came towards her. Her dress was draggled and torn. There was a red line on her cheek where a broken branch had caught and scratched it. "Where's Davey?" she asked. "Deirdre! What has happened?" Mrs. Cameron recognised a tragic urgency in her face. "Come in. You're exhausted. You don't mean to say you've walked from the Wirree?" She took her hand and led her into the kitchen. The fire was sending long ruddy beams of light over the bricked floor, glimmering on the rows of polished metal covers on the walls and the crockery on the wooden dresser at the far end of the room. It was very homely and peaceful, Mrs. Cameron's kitchen. She pushed Deirdre gently into the big armchair by the fire. "Sit there, dearie, till I get you a hot drink," she said. Deirdre sat very still, gazing before her. It's this marriage with McNab is too much for her, Mrs. Cameron thought. "Oh, child, why did you do it? What could have driven you to it?" she asked. The shadow of a slow and subtle smile crept for a moment about Deirdre's lips and vanished again. "If only you'd have told me your trouble," Mrs. Cameron cried. "I might have been able to help you." "Oh, no, you wouldn't," Deirdre said. "You couldn't have married McNab for any reason of choice." Mrs. Cameron was torn between grief, bewilderment and compassion. "Davey is breaking his heart about it, out on the hills somewhere now. I had to tell him when he came in, for fear what's to be done about it, Deirdre? Oh, I'm not wanting to blame you. You did it for a good reason, I'm sure, and you love Davey. It's hard on you, Deirdre. You do love him?" "Yes," Deirdre said slowly. Mrs. Cameron knelt beside the chair. Her hands trembled on the girl's arm. "Don't touch me," Deirdre gasped, moving out of the reach of her hands. "Don't touch me," she whispered again, eyeing her strangely. "Davey, I'm afraid what he'll do if he sees you." Mrs. Cameron hesitated. Deirdre sprang out of the chair, her eyes blazing. "Davey! Davey! It's all Davey with you," she cried. "You sacrificed father to him. You sent him to that trial. I know now. And Davey, why couldn't he have gone to jail instead? He's young and strong and it wouldn't have mattered so much to him. He's got all his life before him. But father, hadn't he done enough for you? Hasn't he given his eyes for you? Hasn't he worshipped you all these years? I've seen it since I was a child. And is this all you could do for him? Send him to the law courts, to get Davey off, knowing that it would be worse than death for him to have to go to prison again? Oh, you knew what he'd have to suffer in Davey's place." Mrs. Cameron put her hands over her face. "You knew he couldn't afford to come under the notice of the law," Deirdre said. "But I shouldn't talk like this." Her voice trailed wearily. "Only I had to choose between father and Davey. McNab knows all the old story. You do, I know. Steve told me. McNab scared the wits out of Steve one day when he was by himself and got all the proofs he wanted, though he seems to have had the facts, most of them anyway, before. Then he told me what being at large before the expiration of sentence meant, and what his information would do if he used it, about father, when the trial was on. He said that he wouldn't use it if I married him." Mrs. Cameron stared at her. Deirdre went on, her voice dragging, as if she could scarcely put into words the pain and trouble of her mind. "I couldn't let father suffer any more. I couldn't bear to think what it would be for him to go back there to the island," she said. "He, blind, and loving me so, and you, and both of us willing to sacrifice him to Davey. I could see him going over there, hurt and alone, in the dark, the dear, great, gentle heart of him crying for those he loved to be near him, to hear the sound of their voices, to touch their hands. I couldn't endure it. Oh, I couldn't." Her head dropped. "He has made sacrifices all his life, his eyes for you." "Don't say that, Deirdre." "It's the truth," the girl said fiercely. "That night of the fires he saw the branch falling. It would have hit you if he had not put up his arm, and it came down on him, on his face, all the red hot embers." Mrs. Cameron uttered a low cry. "And now, at the end of his days, you took this last scrap of freedom from him. But I wouldn't have it. I knew that the time had come for somebody to do something for him." There was a few moments' silence. "Only after all," a weary bitterness surged in her voice, "it was no good. McNab was too clever for me. He trapped me, and sold father all the same. And Steve, poor old Stevie too. M'Laughlin took him down to the Port this afternoon. I heard him crying like a baby. When I asked McNab why he had broken his word to me, he said," a sick little laughter struggled from her, "that blind as father was, he knew he'd have to reckon with him for having taken me if he ever came back to the Wirree." She sat back in the chair, shivering and sobbing. Mrs. Cameron leant towards her. "Don't touch me." Deirdre shrank from her. "I haven't told you all yet. McNab locked me in a room when he knew that I knew what he'd done. It was when he came to me there, and called me his wife. I killed him." Mrs. Cameron fell back from her. "Oh, I didn't mean to kill him," the girl cried distractedly. "He came near me. I told him not to, but he did. He talked of his rights. I hit at him, to keep him away from me, with something that was lying on the table. I don't know what it was, but it was heavy, and he fell down. I knew he was dead by the way he lay there, without moving, and then I ran out of the room and came here. Oh, I didn't mean to do it, but I'm not sorry it's done. That he is dead and can do no more harm to any of us. He killed Conal, and it was he that shot at Davey. He would have again too. He was afraid of Davey, what he would do when he found out about father and me." She was sobbing breathlessly. Her hands went out before her with a desperate, despairing gesture. She moved towards the door. "Where are you going? What are you going to do, Deirdre?" Mrs. Cameron followed her. "I don't know." The girl stood quivering by the doorpost. "Only I must go. They may come from the Wirree and find me here. And I don't want to be hanged. That's what they do with people who have done what I've done, isn't it? I want to go. Davey mustn't see me. It's no good. No good. There would be the great gulf between us always, and as long as I lived, to the day of my death, I'd be on the other side of it, with my arms out to him. Oh, you mustn't keep me. Can't you see it's best that I should go, now, like this, before—" "You're not thinking of doing any harm to yourself, Deirdre?" The anguished eyes of the woman beside her reached the girl through the maze and terror of her thoughts. They calmed the tumult within her. "The Long Gully," she said simply, wearily. "The mists are so deep in it tonight, and there would be no waking in the morning." Mrs. Cameron took her hand. "You say I've never done anything for your father, Deirdre. I want to do something for him now. Come back and listen to me for a moment." She led the girl back to the chair and forced her into it. "But they'll be coming for me soon," Deirdre cried fretfully, looking back at the door. She hardly heard what Mrs. Cameron was saying for a while. Her tired, bright eyes wandered restlessly up and down the room. The pain in her head prevented her thinking. "Deirdre, darling," Mrs. Cameron said, her voice trembling, "there's not a man or woman in the country would not say you were justified. And no woman is better able to understand than I am. I'm not afraid for you, and there's no one I'd rather have for Davey's wife than you. You were willing to sacrifice yourself. But when treachery had been proved against you, there was that within you would not let evil come near you." "Do you mean you'd be satisfied for Davey to have me?" Deirdre asked. "Yes." Mrs. Cameron's eyes were on hers. "You'd not be throwing it up at me that I did this?" Deirdre inquired. "And that father—" "No." Mrs. Cameron's voice was very low. "Because if I had been served as your father was, I'd have been a convict too." In the shock of what she had said, Deirdre forgot her own trouble. "You?" she whispered. "That's what I wanted to tell you. It's been locked in my heart so long, and nobody else knows," Mrs. Cameron said. "It's because I think it may help you, Deirdre, now that your soul is in the deep waters. I want you to know that something like what has happened to you happened to me long ago, only I had less excuse." Her face was torn with grief. She turned from the girl, overwhelmed by the flood tide of dark memories. "Oh, I can't think of it without all the agony again," she cried. And after a moment continued. "I didn't want to bring shame on my people by having it known. I had been the cause of death to a man. But the weight was on my soul. I had heard of people escaping public trial by condemning themselves to transportation. It was the only way I could have any peace of mind, I thought, taking on myself the punishment other women had got for doing what I did. But it was never as bad for me as for them. Davey's father saw me on the wharf among the emigrant women, and he wanted to marry me. There was a government bounty, £30 I think it was, given to married couples coming to the colony, and he wanted the money to begin with in the new country. I told him why I was going out, and he was willing to take me. There were terrible days of fear among all the rough people I found myself with, till he came. I was grateful to him, and swore to be a good and faithful wife to him. I've not spoken of this since then, Deirdre. I'm telling you because I want you not to throw your life away, not to waste it. I know I was wrong. There was this difference between what you did and what I did. I was not in a corner, fighting for my life as you were. I did not mean to take life. I did not mean to. It was an accident, really. Right was on my side, but I was angry, or the accident would never have happened. I have suffered from knowing that. All these years have made little difference. That's why I was always wanting to help convicts and prisoners in the old days, and it angered Davey's father so. I felt that they were suffering what I ought to have been suffering too. But with you it was different. Your own instinct tells you the difference. It does not accuse you. No one else will either. And there's your father to think of. It would take the last gleam of happiness from him to know you had ended your own life, Deirdre. And there's Davey and me to love you and care for you, always." Deirdre stared at her. Then the tears came. She cried quietly. Mrs. Cameron put her arms round her. She comforted her with tender little murmurings. Deirdre raised her head and put her off from her, gazing into her face with drenched eyes. "I understand ever so much better now," she said. And a moment later, "Have I been mad with fright? What'll I do? My head aches so. I scarcely know what I'm saying. I can't think. What shall I do? What is going to happen to me?" "There's no jury in the country that would not acquit you," Mrs. Cameron said. "McNab was well known. Oh, people were afraid of him, but they will speak now. You're young and beautiful, and if your story is not a justification, there's no God watching over the world." "But what will Davey think of me?" Deirdre cried. "I'm afraid to see him. I wanted to when I came here, but I'm afraid now. I thought it would be to say goodbye. They'll be coming for me soon too. Oh, I'll go now, Mrs. Cameron. If Davey looked at my hands and knew what they had done." Conflicting thoughts, whipping each other, were driving her like a leaf, first one way and then the other. There was a heavy step on the threshold. Davey's figure loomed against the doorway. Coming in from the light, it was a few minutes before his eyes, accustomed to the gloom, saw that there was someone with his mother. He stared at Deirdre as though they were ghosts who were meeting after death, beyond the world. She shrank from the stare of his eyes. Putting up her arms to hide her face, with a little pitiful cry, she moved along the wall towards the door, as if to go out and escape them. "Davey! Davey! Don't let her go!" Mrs. Cameron cried. Although his eyes followed her, and he seemed to guess her intention, he did not stir. "Davey!" Mrs. Cameron cried, a pang in her heart like the blade of a knife. "She has killed McNab and is going to her death because of it." Deirdre stood still. Her arms dropped from her face. She threw back her head. Her eyes met his unflinchingly. You have killed him?" His voice was harsh with the effort to speak. "Yes," she said. A gust of passion rushed over him. It flooded him with a vigour and exultation that transformed him. He strode towards her. His arms imprisoned her. He held her and kissed her with the hungry kiss of a lover, long denied. "Deirdre, Deirdre," he sobbed, "that you should have... It was for me to do that. I meant to, tonight. Do you think I could have lived, breathed, been sane while you were near him?" He crushed her in his arms again. They sobbed together childishly. Mrs. Cameron went into the other room, her sitting room with its shiny black horsehair furniture, and the cupboard in which her spinning wheel had stood since the days of Donald Cameron's greatness. The beloved blue vase that she had saved from the fire was still on the chiffonier. She sat in the room she had been so proud of, a long time, her hands clasped in her lap, reviewing her memories. They came in straggling lines and phalanxes, memories of her youth, of an old sad time, of her voyage across the seas beside Donald Cameron, of their journey into the hills, of the days of struggle and toil and domestic tranquillity that had given her a son, of her first fear and loneliness in the silent world of the trees, and of the gaunt men who had come to her out of them. The complexities of human emotion were a mystery and a distress to her. She had the momentary vision of a prison yard, its grim walls, trains of sullen men in grimy grey and yellow clothes, all of the same pattern, and of one who walked among them, wearily, a little uncertainly, singing faintly as she had often heard him singing on the hill roads. Her eyes went down to the slope of the hill, to the spot under the light-leafed trees where Donald Cameron had been laid to rest, her heart crying an assurance of loyalty and fidelity to the yoke-mate. They had set a seed in the country that would bear fruit in the union of the two in the next room, she knew. All the labour of their pioneering had not been in vain. Donald Cameron had done what he had set out to do, though his last days had been darkened with disappointment, the bitter sense of disgrace and the futility of all his long years of toil. But his name would go on, she realised, and his children's children would talk with pride of their grandfather, who had come from the old country, a poor man, and had made a great name for himself in the new land. Of the spiritual undertow which bound Deirdre and Davey she could not think. That was entwined with the subtle, inexplicable currents of her own soul. She had turned her face from them, shut her eyes and ears to the sound and sight of them. She had never allowed herself to recognize their existence even, yet she knew that they were there, rushing on, silently, irresistibly, into eternity. A vision of the prison yard came again, shaping itself slowly, vaguely, and with it a sound of chains, the harsh voices of warders and gaolers. Her thoughts went back to the lovers in the other room. She folded her hands with a little passionate gesture. The light of her whole soul shone in her eyes. "Oh God," she whispered breathlessly, "we broke the earth, we sowed the seed. Let theirs be the harvest, the joy of life, and the fullness thereof." End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of The Pioneers by Katharine Susannah Pritchard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsty. 15 years after. A boy pushed the bracken and ferny grey and green wattle sprays from before a lichen-grown wooden cross. He was a sturdy youngster, with an eager, sensitive face, and dropped on one knee beside the mound the parted ferns and branches revealed, to read the inscription on the cross. The path that wound uphill through the trees behind him was an old one, overgrown with mosses. Scraps of bark and sear leaves were matted across it. The weathered, rambling homestead of Ayrmuir was just visible through the trees, and a cornfield waving down the slope of the hill showed golden through a gap in the waving leafage. Donald Cameron had marked the place long before, and said that there, where the wagon had come to a standstill, he must be laid to rest. And it was within memory of the boy that his grandmother, Mary Cameron, had been laid beside him. A voice floating down the hillside from the house called, "Dan! Dan!" Deirdre came down the path towards him, an older, graver Deirdre, with peace in her deep-welled eyes, though an undefinable shadow rested on her face. "Here you are, dear," she said. "It'll be time to be getting ready soon. Mick has the horses in, and your father won't like to be kept waiting. There was so much I wanted to say to you too, before you go up to this big school. It won't be a bit like going to the school down here, or doing Latin with me, going to the grammar school, Dan." "No, of course, mother." "I wonder sometimes if I've been wrong to keep you so much with me," she said wistfully. "You had to be told all the terrible old story. I told you myself, because I wanted you to understand." "Mother." There were reverence and adoration in his eyes as they rested on her. "You're sure you don't feel strange about your mother, Dan?" she asked. "A jury acquitted me, but I know I was right myself. There was nothing else to do." She was quivering to the shock of startled memories. "I can't feel that I could have done anything else than I did," she cried passionately. "But I can't forget, Dan. The horror of it all shadows me still. It always will." The boy slipped his arms through hers and pressed against her. "Whenever I read in history, or a story of people who had to do terrible things for those they loved, I think, like my mother. But no one I've ever read or heard of was like you," he said shyly. "Dan!" A smile of melting, eager tenderness suffused her eyes. As they turned away, he looked back at the grave under the trees. "I thought I'd like to say good bye to them," he said. "They were pioneers, weren't they, grandfather and grandmother? Makes me feel like being a bit of history myself, to think that my grandfather and grandmother were pioneers. I was saying to myself just now, they did so much against such big odds. What a lot I ought to be able to do with everything made easy for me. I wish your father and mother were down here too," he added. "I never knew my mother, Dan," Deirdre said dreamily. "You know I've told you all about that. She died when I was born, and it was because I was such a wailing baby that my father called me Deirdre. Deirdre of the Griefs. And he lies over there in the island." "I remember him," the boy said eagerly, his voice hushed. "When I was a little kid we went, you and I and father, to see him, didn't we? And I sort of remember a tall thin man who had white hair. Quite white hair, and was blind. He was always singing, so as you could scarcely hear him. And once he said suddenly when I was on his knee, don't you remember, 'He's got her eyes, Deirdre.'" "Yes," Deirdre murmured, the pain in her eyes deepening. I've often wondered what he meant, mother. How could he know what my eyes were like? He was blind." "He meant your grandmother, Mary Cameron, Dan. He used to say she had twilight eyes, and that the light of them pierced his darkness," Deirdre said. The boy puzzled over that. "I remember she said to me once," he said thoughtfully, "you ought to be a great man, Dan, because 4 great nations have gone to the making of you. I didn't know what she meant at first. Then she told me that my 4 grandparents were English, Irish, Scottish and Welsh. They have quarrelled and fought among themselves, but you are a gathering of them in a new country, Dan," she said. "There will be a great future for the nation that comes of you and the boys and girls like you. It will be a nation of pioneers, with all the adventurous, toiling strain of the men and women who came over the sea and conquered the wilderness. You belong to the hunted too, and suffering has taught you." Then she told me about prisons here in the early days, mother, and terrible stories of how people lived in the old country. "They may talk about your birth stain by and by, Dan," she said, "but that will not trouble you, because it was not this country made the stain. This country has been the Redeemer and blotted out all those old stains." Deirdre gazed into the eager, wistful face of her son, realised that he was unfolding a dream to her. She smiled into his eyes and he back to her with a consciousness of the serene understanding and sympathy between them. "You will be a pioneer too, Dan," Grandmother said, the boy continued with a shy reverence, "a pioneer of paths that will make the world a better, happier place for everybody to live in. You will, because you won't be able to help it. There's the blood of pioneers in you." End of chapter 48. End of The Pioneers by Katharine Susannah Pritchard.